My name is Jade. I am 32 years old, and for the last 10 years, I have been legally dead, murdered on paper by my own parents so they could hand my $15 million trust fund and my entire identity over to my cousin, Chloe. They thought they had buried me in an unmarked grave of lies. But they forgot one thing. I built the high-end security system they're currently living behind, and I have the master key. The iron gates of the Blackwood estate groaned as they swung open, the heavy steel hinges protesting against the mid-December chill. I sat in the driver's seat of my matte black Tesla, watching the driveway light up as the motion sensors flickered to life. It was 3:09 a.m. The house ahead was a sprawling, multi-million-dollar colonial that used to be my home. Now it was just a cage filled with people who had spent a decade pretending I had drowned in a boating accident off the coast of Maine. I didn't reach for the garage remote. I didn't need to. I tapped a series of commands into my phone, a proprietary override code I had written during those long, lonely years in exile. The garage door didn't just open. It glitched, hesitated, and then slid upward with a sound like a metallic sigh. I drove into the darkness of my own past. My tires crunched over the cold concrete, a sound that felt like thunder in the silence of the night. I stepped out of the car, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. I wasn't wearing a disguise. I wasn't sneaking around like a thief. I walked through the side door that led directly into the mudroom, the same mudroom where my mother used to hang her wet coats after tennis matches. Everything was exactly the same. The smell of expensive eucalyptus and floor wax was a sensory assault, a smell that had haunted my nightmares for years. I walked into the kitchen, the marble countertops glinting in the pale moonlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I reached for the light switch, but I didn't flip it. I didn't need to see. I knew this house better than the people currently sleeping upstairs. I knew where the creaky floorboard was in the hallway. I knew which cupboard held the crystal wine glasses, and I knew exactly which wall panel hid the panic button for the estate's security system. I poured myself a glass of water from the tap, the cold liquid soothing my throat. I stood there, listening. The house was breathing. It felt heavy, filled with the collective weight of 1,000 secrets. Upstairs, the master bedroom door opened, footsteps. The heavy, dragging stride of my father, Robert. He was coming down for his nightly scotch. I retreated into the shadows of the pantry, my heart hammering a rhythm against my ribs, not of fear, but of pure, adrenaline-fueled focus. He didn't see me. He walked right past the pantry door, his silk pajamas rustling, and poured his drink. He looked old. The back of his neck was mottled with age spots, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his guilt, or maybe just his greed. I watched him from the shadows, a ghost in his own house, and for one brief moment, I felt the urge to jump out and scream, to show him the face he had tried to erase. But that would be a waste. That would be messy. I wasn't here for a tantrum. I was here for a surgical removal. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled this family from the inside out and reclaimed the life they stole, take a quick second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, but only if you believe that justice is a dish best served after a decade of careful planning. Drop a comment below and tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and is the night air as cold as it is here? I read every single one. Now let me tell you how I became the architect of my own resurrection. My name is Jade, and 10 years ago, I was just a girl with a future. I was 22, finishing my final semester at an Ivy League university, and the sole beneficiary of a $15 million trust fund left by my paternal grandfather. I was the good daughter, the one who spent her weekends studying, the one who won debates, the one who never asked for much. But in the eyes of my parents, Robert and Linda, I was just a vessel for the inheritance they couldn't touch until I turned 25. That was the year Chloe appeared. She was my cousin, the daughter of my mother's sister, and she was everything I wasn't. She was loud, she was reckless, and she was exactly the kind of person my parents could manipulate. When she failed out of college for the second time, my parents didn't look at it as a tragedy. They looked at it as an opportunity. They needed someone who would be their puppet, someone who would hand over the trust fund the second it hit their bank account. And to do that, the original Jade had to go. I remember the day of the accident. It was a Tuesday in August. We were in Maine for the family retreat. My father told me we were going out on the boat to look at the sunset, just us. My mother was strangely quiet, her face drawn, her eyes avoiding mine. We sailed out until the shoreline was just a thin, gray line on the horizon. My father stopped the engine. The silence was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. "Jade," my father said, his voice unusually soft. "Your mother and I have been thinking. Chloe needs a fresh start. You have your education, you have your brain. Why don't you go ahead and disappear for a while? Let her take your place." I laughed, thinking it was a sick joke. "What are you talking about?" My mother finally looked at me, and there was no warmth in her eyes, only calculation. "We made the arrangements, Jade. You're going to be lost at sea. We've already contacted a friend in London who will give you a new identity. If you stay, if you ever try to come back, we will make sure you disappear for real. Do you understand?" They didn't give me a choice. They had already hired people. They had already set the scene. They put me on a private boat to a nearby harbor, pushed me onto the dock with a fake passport and $1,000, and told me that if I ever mentioned my name was Jade Bennett again, I wouldn't live to see the next day. They had spent months preparing for this. They had already introduced Chloe to their social circle as me. They had photoshopped her face into my childhood albums. They had essentially practiced a murder in plain sight. I left with nothing. I left because I was terrified, and because I was young, and because I didn't know how to fight a war against the people who were supposed to be my protectors. I spent the next 5 years running. I moved from city to city, constantly looking over my shoulder. I changed my name. I changed my hair. I changed my entire life. I was a ghost, wandering through the world while Chloe lived in my house, slept in my bed, and spent my inheritance. I felt like an invisible person for a long time. There is a deep, agonizing hollow that forms in your chest when you realize your own flesh and blood would rather kill you on paper than see you live a life they can't control. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw the face that was currently being used to scam my family's social circle. I felt like I was erased, rubbed out like a typo in a legal document. But then I did something my parents never expected. I grew up. I realized that if I was going to be a ghost, I might as well become a haunting one. I started learning the things they tried to hide from me. I went back to school, not for business or debate, but for computer science. I fell in love with the logic of code, with the way you could build worlds out of nothingness. I became an expert in system architecture and network security. I learned how to break into the most secure systems in the world, not to steal, but to understand how the world was locked down. I lived in silence, building my skills, waiting. I knew that one day, the house of cards they built would need to be collapsed, and I knew that when that day came, I would be the one holding the match. Let me pause here for a second. If you have ever been treated like a placeholder in your own family, someone meant to be easily replaced by a better version of yourself, how did that feel? Did you try to fight for your spot, or did you do what I did and leave to find your own worth? Tell me in the comments below. Now, let's get into how the ghost of Jade began to track her prey. I started small. I used my skills to monitor them from the shadows. It wasn't hard. People like my parents and Chloe are obsessed with the image of their lives. They posted everything on social media. I tracked their vacations, their spending, their legal dealings. I watched Chloe graduate from a university I had paid for with my trust fund. I watched her get engaged to a man who looked exactly like the type of guy I would have detested. And then I saw the rot. It wasn't just the trust fund they were after. My father had been reckless. He was using the trust fund to cover his company's mounting debt, gambling on high-risk stocks that were starting to tank. The lifestyle they were living, the Jade Bennett lifestyle, was being funded by a mountain of credit and lies. They weren't just thieves. They were failing. But I didn't move. Not yet. I needed them to be comfortable. I needed them to think they were untouchable. I spent 2 years becoming a consultant for the very law firm that handled their estate planning. I used an alias, of course, and my credentials were airtight. I got close enough to their financial records to see every crack in their foundation. They were 2 months away from defaulting on the Blackwood estate mortgage. They were 2 months away from losing the very house they had killed me to keep. It was time to pay a visit. I spent weeks back in the city, but I didn't go near them. I moved into an apartment 3 streets away from the estate. I watched them go to their dinners. I watched them park their cars. I saw Chloe driving my convertible, the one I had picked out when I was 17. Seeing her behind the wheel, pretending to be me, didn't make me angry anymore. It made me feel a cold, detached pity. They were playing house with a life they didn't earn, and the landlord was coming to collect. The night I broke back into the Blackwood estate, the air felt different. I wasn't an intruder. I was the owner reclaiming her space. I bypassed the security system I had actually designed during my college internship, a system I had subtly modified years ago, knowing one day I'd need a back door. The cameras didn't blink when I walked past. The motion sensors were programmed to ignore my specific heat signature. I walked into the kitchen and made myself a glass of water, watching my father pour his drink. When he finished, he trudged upstairs, the floorboards groaning under his weight. I waited until I heard his door click shut. Then I headed to the study. The study was where my father kept the black ledger. My grandfather had left a ledger that detailed every asset, every offshore account, and every hidden transaction of the Bennett family. For years, I had suspected it existed, but I had never been able to find it. I started checking the shelves, behind the leather-bound copies of The Great Gatsby, behind the collection of antique navigational tools. Then, I saw it. A slight gap in the wood paneling near the fireplace. I pressed the trigger hidden behind a brass sconce. Click. The panel slid back, revealing a wall safe. I didn't need a combination. I used my laptop to bypass the electronic lock in under 30 seconds. Inside was the ledger. I flipped it open, and the breath hitched in my throat. It was all there. Every illicit transaction my father had made to cover his debts. Every illegal tax shelter he had built to hide his money from the IRS. It was enough evidence to bury the entire family for 20 years. I was about to pull my phone out to photograph the pages when I heard a sound. "Who's there?" It was Chloe. She was standing in the doorway, a robe wrapped around her, her eyes wide with terror. She had probably heard a floorboard creak. I slowly turned around. The moonlight hit my face, and for the first time in 10 years, Chloe saw the real Jade Bennett. She didn't scream. She froze, her hands gripping the doorframe. She looked like she was seeing a ghost, because in her mind, she was. "Jade?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. You're dead." "I'm very much alive, Chloe," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And I'm here to take back my life." I didn't lunge at her. I didn't attack her. I just stepped toward her and she crumbled. She backed away until she hit the wall, her chest heaving. "Don't hurt me," she sobbed. "I don't need to hurt you," I said, looking at the ledger in my hand. "You've done a much better job of destroying yourself than I ever could." I turned and walked out of the study, out of the house, and back into the night. I had the ledger. I had the evidence. The endgame had officially begun. But I wasn't going to turn them in to the police. Not yet. That was too easy. They deserved to watch their world disappear piece by piece, exactly how they had done to me. I was going to be the landlord of their misery, and the eviction notice was already being written. I drove home that night with the windows down, feeling the cold wind on my face. For the first time in a decade, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like the architect, and the blueprints were ready. Let me pause here again. Seeing the girl who stole my life face to face, seeing her realize that her stolen identity was finally coming to an end, it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. What would you have done if you stood face to face with the person who stole everything from you? Would you have been as calm as I was? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you are ready to see how I dismantle their lives one piece at a time, from the foreclosure to the public unmasking, you need to make sure you are subscribed. Now, let me tell you how the collapse really started. I didn't wait for them to notice the ledger was missing. I knew my father was too arrogant to check his safe every day. Instead, I began the quiet work of financial sabotage. I didn't use hacking. I didn't use illegal software. I used the one thing that is more powerful than any code, the law. Using my anonymous LLC, I started purchasing the small business loans my father had taken out to fund his lifestyle. I contacted the banks, paid the full outstanding balance, and became the sole lien holder on every piece of equipment he owned. He thought he was paying the bank. He was actually paying me. Next, I turned my attention to the inheritance fund itself. According to the grandfather's original will, the trust fund was specifically tied to the name Jade Bennett. Because my parents had legally murdered Jade Bennett to let Chloe take my place, the trust fund technically became an unclaimed asset. I initiated a legal challenge. I didn't do it as Jade. I did it through a top-tier law firm representing an anonymous claimant who had proof that the original Jade Bennett was still alive. The lawyers were relentless. They filed motions. They demanded audits. They subpoenaed the medical records from the Maine boating accident. Records that were, predictably, full of inconsistencies. My parents were losing their minds. They were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees just to keep the truth from surfacing. Their liquidity was vanishing. The more they fought, the more they spent, and the faster the Blackwood estate moved toward foreclosure. I watched the whole thing from the comfort of my own home, watching their stress levels spike through the internal metadata on their bank accounts. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash where the passengers were too busy fighting over the radio to notice the cliff. But the final blow? That was the most personal one of all. Chloe had been invited to a gala for the city's elite, the same gala my mother used to drag me to, where I had to stand in the corner and serve drinks. It was the centerpiece of their social calendar. They had spent months preparing for it, buying the most expensive tickets, planning the most elaborate outfits. They needed this night. They needed to remind the world that the Bennetts were still the kings and queens of the city. I decided that was the night the ghost would finally make an appearance. I didn't just walk in. I didn't just show up. I bought the company that was sponsoring the event. When the night of the gala arrived, the ballroom was packed. There was a sea of tuxedos and gowns, the sound of champagne toasts, the feeling of untouchable wealth. I stood in the back of the room, wearing a simple, elegant black dress, watching the family interact. They looked so happy, so secure in their stolen lives. My father was on stage, giving a speech about resilience and family legacy. He looked out at the crowd, beaming. "We've faced some challenges," he said, gesturing to my mother and Chloe. "But our family is stronger than ever. The Bennett legacy is built to last." The applause was polite, scattered. I walked up to the sound booth at the back of the room. I had already cleared it with the AV tech, a guy who worked for the firm I now owned. I handed him a USB drive. "What's on this?" he asked. "The truth," I said. As my father finished his speech, the lights dimmed. He turned toward the large projector screen behind him, expecting to see a slideshow of his glorious family history. Instead, the screen flickered to life. It started with a document, the fake death certificate, the one signed by the crooked doctor. The date was clearly visible. The seal was official. Then, the screen shifted. It showed a bank transfer, $50,000 to a Dr. Marcus Vane, then another transfer, $20,000 for travel expenses. The ballroom went dead silent. My father looked at the screen, his face turning an impossible shade of purple. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. The screen changed again. It was a video clip. It was the security footage from the night they threw me out of the warehouse. It was grainy, but you could see my face. You could see the fear. You could see them standing under their golf umbrella, laughing while I scrambled in the rain. The audio from the video clip was crystal clear. "In business, you have to cut your losses. You're a terrible investment. It's time you pack up your little hobby and get a real job." Richard's voice boomed through the speakers, magnified 10 times. The entire ballroom was in shock. 200 of the city's most important people stood there, watching their idol be unmasked as a cruel, cold-blooded fraud. My mother tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat. Chloe just stood there, her champagne glass slipping from her fingers, shattering on the polished wood floor. I stood in the back of the ballroom, watching their world burn. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt light. The light of the projector screen illuminated the entire room, and for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't hiding in the shadows. I was the person who turned the lights on. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I turned around and walked out of the ballroom into the crisp, cool air of the night. As I walked to my car, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Not for me, for them. My father had been embezzling money from the trust fund to cover his debts, and he had been using the name of a dead girl to do it. The evidence on that screen was more than enough to trigger a federal investigation into tax fraud, identity theft, and corporate embezzlement. I drove home and parked my car. I went into my house, locked the door, and took a deep breath. My life was finally mine. No stolen names, no fake identities, no ghosts, just me. If you have ever felt like you were nothing more than a placeholder, if you have ever felt like your own family would rather see you erased than see you succeed, remember this: they can take your name, they can take your money, they can try to bury you under a mountain of lies, but they can't take your mind, they can't take your resilience, and they certainly can't take your future if you refuse to give it to them. You are the architect of your own story. If they try to write you out, pick up the pen and write them out instead. If you found a piece of yourself in this, or if you just love watching karma do its job, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own power. The fallout from the Gala was not just a scandal, it was a total systemic collapse. By the time I reached my apartment, my phone was a lit-up fuse of notifications, missed calls, frantic voicemails from my mother, and legal threats from lawyers who had only hours ago been my father's hired guns. I didn't answer a single one. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water and watched the city lights, feeling a strange, hollow peace. I had spent 10 years as a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that wasn't mine. Now, the ghost had a name, and that name was about to become the only thing that mattered in the local courtrooms. The next morning, I met with the lead investigator from the federal authorities, a man I had been feeding evidence to for months under my alias. We didn't talk about family. We talked about wire fraud, identity theft, and the systematic looting of an estate. My father wasn't just a cruel man. He was a criminal who had used me as his fall guy for decades of tax evasion. I watched from the sidelines as the Bennett empire was dismantled. It was surgical, it was professional, and it was absolutely relentless. When the dust finally settled, the Blackwood estate, that massive, hollow colonial mansion, was put up for auction by the federal government to recover the stolen trust fund assets. I didn't need to do any more hiding. I walked into that auction house in broad daylight, surrounded by a team of lawyers, and I placed the winning bid. I bought my childhood home back for a fraction of its original value, using the very money my father had tried to hide from me. But I didn't move back in. I didn't want to live in the echoes of their arrogance. I kept the title, I kept the deed, and then I hired a demolition crew. I stood on the sidewalk as the wrecking ball swung for the first time. The house crumbled, dust and memories billowing into the sky. A group of neighbors gathered, whispering, but I didn't care. I watched every wall I had been told I didn't belong in turn to rubble. I watched the fireplace where my mother used to sit and judge me vanish into a pile of brick. It was the most expensive, most beautiful thing I had ever bought. I took a piece of the foundation, a single heavy stone, and put it in my garden in Boston. It was a reminder, a trophy, a tombstone for the girl they thought they had killed. Let's pause one last time. Seeing the family that built a legacy on my death realize that I was the one holding the hammer. Did I go too far? Or was the wrecking ball the only language they would ever understand? Drop a comment below. I want to know your verdict. The resolution didn't come in a courtroom, but in a sterile, fluorescent-lit hospital ward 3 months later. My father had suffered a massive stroke the week his assets were frozen. The man who once boomed over the sound of rain, the man who held a cigar like a scepter, was now trapped in a wheelchair, unable to speak clearly, his world reduced to the 4 walls of a state-funded facility. I went to visit him. I didn't tell the nurses who I was. I just walked in. He was staring out the window at a patch of gray sky. When he saw my reflection in the glass, his eyes didn't widen in shock. They just dimmed. as if the last flicker of his fight had finally extinguished. He knew. He had known for months that the ghost was real. I pulled up a chair. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't need to. "You chose them, Dad," I said, my voice quiet, devoid of the anger I had carried for a decade. "You chose a cousin who didn't care about you and a wife who only cared about your wallet. You chose an image of a family over the actual flesh and blood daughter who loved you." He made a gurgling sound, a pathetic, desperate attempt to speak, his hand reaching out to touch my sleeve. I didn't pull away, but I didn't offer comfort. "I'm not here for an apology," I continued. "I'm here because I want you to know that the Jade Bennett you tried to murder is doing just fine. She's happy, she's safe, and she's finally free." I stood up to leave, but he gripped my wrist. His strength was gone, his grip nothing more than a tremor. His eyes were pleading. I gently pried his fingers off my sleeve. "There is no more Jade Bennett to save you, Dad. There's only the woman you tried to bury, and she has nothing left to say to you." I walked out of that hospital and into the brightest sunshine I had ever seen. I had done it. I had survived the erasure, the exile, and the betrayal. I hadn't become them. I hadn't become bitter. I had become the architect of a life that was entirely, undeniably mine. If you are watching this and you feel like you are currently trapped in a situation where you are being treated like a placeholder, a good enough for now backup, or someone whose potential is being stifled by people who need you to be small, hear me now. You are not the version of yourself they tried to erase. You are not the terrible investment, the dramatic daughter, or the invisible child. Your worth is not a currency they can spend or withhold. Your value is inherent. And the moment you decide that you are the architect of your own story, their power over you evaporates. I spent 10 years living in the shadows of a family that didn't want me. I spent thousands of nights wondering if I was the problem. I wasn't. The problem was their inability to see that love, family, and success are not things you steal from others. They are things you build with the people who actually deserve your presence. I have a life now that they don't even know exists. I have friends who celebrate my wins without keeping score. I have a partner who doesn't need to be defended because he stands beside me, not behind me. Setting boundaries is not revenge. It is the highest form of self-respect. It is the act of building a fence around your soul and only letting people inside who respect the architecture. If you are currently in the rain, if you are currently holding your life in a cardboard box, waiting for the storm to break, keep moving. Build in the dark. Silence is the loudest weapon you have, and when you finally stand in the light, the view from the top is worth every single drop of rain. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, if it gave you hope, or if you just love watching karma do its job, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own power. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next story.